So what I'd like to do is show you guys what happens when you float a div. Like, what does that actually mean? Okay, a lot of you may use this when you use CSS and work with Dreamweaver and work with the web, but I just want to show you what actually happens. This went a long way to helping me understand how my layout worked. So I've got this PDF open here called floats2.pdf, and it says what actually happens when you float a div. Now, a div obviously is like a box or, let's say, a frame in InDesign or something like that. And let's say we've got two divs on our page. Okay, they stack on top of each other like Legos. Now, the way we typically do it is we float the top div, typically. The reason why, you'll see in a minute when I show you guys in Dreamweaver, is because when you float something, all the content beneath it and to the right moves up and basically kind of aligns to its top edge. That red dotted line right there, let's pretend that's the top of the page, let's say. So let's suppose I give this sidebar div a width. They're still on top of each other. They're like Legos. They don't like slip past each other. Divs are block level elements, which means they clear each other. They can't go next to each other by default. So what we've got to do is we've got to trick it here. What we're going to do is we're going to apply a float to the sidebar div, this style, and what it does is it says, okay, pull the div called sidebar out or off the page. The main content div, you can't really see it, moves up. Then the sidebar div is kind of floated right on top of the main content. Now, this is where people get confused. I got confused for a long time. If you were to look at this right here from the side, you'd see that main content goes all the way across the page still. Sidebar is just floating over it. It's just covering part of the main content. So the last thing we do is we come out here and we take the main content div and we push it from the edge using margin or something like that. And then we get something like this. So it appears that they're next to each other, but the sidebar div is actually kind of floating on top. Now, there's not really that big of a gap, you guys. I'm just kind of, I'm trying to show you what it looks like, basically. Now, I've got a little animation here that will help as well, I hope. So let's suppose we have three divs here. And I take div number 2 here, and I assign float left. So what I'm going to do, you guys, and I'm going to put a width on it as well. Because if you don't put a width on it, it's going to cover another one up. So I assign a float to that. So here's what happens. When I assign the float to div 2, let me click on it. It'll get pulled off the page. Div 3 will slide up. Then it'll go over here. And if I put a width on that div, it'll just go over the top of div 3 here. It's floating right here. Now, the odd thing, you guys, is that the divs work this way. But what's inside the divs will actually wrap around this div number 2. So what's in div 3 will wrap around div 2. It's a little odd, I know, but this is the way floats work. So if I go over to Dreamweaver, and I've got 3 divs set up here, very similar concept, I'll go to div 2 and I'll apply a float to it. So you guys take a look over on my CSS Styles panel. I've already got a div 2 over there. I'll open that up, double click, come to the style for div 2, come to box, you'll see float. I'll choose float left, click apply, take a look. You're going to see, look what it does. Div 2 is actually sitting on top. Let me get rid of the background on that div. So I'll say none, basically. Sitting on top. Now, unfortunately, div 2 needs a width. So I'm going to come to box here and put a width in it and say maybe 200 for a sidebar. I'll click apply, take a look. You guys can see what's going on. Okay. So float left, we got it out there. Now, I'm going to go out there. I've got my content set. I'm going to click OK. What I want to do is I want to show you guys what would happen if we didn't do the top div right here. Like, what would happen if we didn't do that one? Okay. Now, you guys are going to see, look what happens here. Doesn't it look like it's actually working? I'm just going on nonchalantly, whatever. But let me take it out to the browser. I'm going to show you guys this. It's going to say to save it. For some reason, Dreamweaver is not previewing it correctly. So you guys can see the div is going all the way underneath div 2. I took away the background and it's not there. So you can't always trust what Dreamweaver tells you. Now, the last step here would be to go to div 3 here. Go to my style for div 3 that we created. I'm using a class, you guys. You can do that. Go to box and say, let's put some margin on the left of at least 200 pixels. I'll put 210 to be safe here, and you guys can see what it's doing. Now, don't worry what it's doing here, you guys. I'm going to click OK. I'm going to save it. Dreamweaver is being kind of a pain. I'll go out to a browser like Internet Explorer, let's say, and there we go. That's how we set up the floats. Now, there's a lot of ways we can do this, you guys. We can float all of them. You can get really tricky with this, but I just wanted to explain how a float works. The last quick thing I want to do is get rid of the formatting I just did. Let me get rid of all this formatting, you guys, because I want to show you something here that can be pretty important. I'm going to go to div 3 here and get rid of that margin. Let me just set it back where it was. If I were to float, let's say div 3, let's say that div 2 is going to be my sidebar. Let me type that in. I'll say sidebar, and this is going to be like main content. Okay? You guys will do this by accident. I'm going to go to this div right here, which is div 3. I'm going to float that one and show you guys what happens if I float that one. So I'll go to box, float left, put a width on it. I'm going a little fast here. I apologize. I'll click apply, take a look. Look what happens. You guys, the way float works, like I said, is for a div, even for images or anything you guys happen to float, whatever's beneath it or to the right is going to come up, wrap around it, and stop at the top edge of the div. Sidebar is above it, div 1 is above it, so it's not going to do anything to it. So, like I said, if you're going to float things, make sure you do the right order. You're going to float the right one. Some people will float, like I mentioned earlier, all the divs and get them out there because sometimes that can be a little bit easier, but that's a little further along. So, anyway. This is what happens when you float divs. That's all I wanted to do, just show you guys, take you through it, and hopefully you understand how it works.